Okay, folks. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah? All right. Sorry about the delay again. I'm still trying to figure all of this stuff out, moving from the webcam to the DocuCam and then juggling all this other different stuff. I'm afraid I'll forget something, but hopefully that won't be the case. Okay. Anyway, thanks for coming today. We've got a bunch of people who are participating remotely. And what I want to try to accomplish today is to finish up the last few slides on this section on the benefits of the free exchange system. And then I was hoping to kind of devote, I don't know, the rest of the class or at least some amount of time to giving you guys an opportunity to do some practice problems, and we can kind of do them together to check answers and whatnot. So we won't move into any new material today. That won't be until next week. I do have your, I did not bring your quizzes back. I'm going to leave those in my office. I've graded them, and I'm going to attach extra credit based on how well you did on the quiz on your first midterm exam. Instead of trying to hand back papers and send emails to everyone, I can just post the answer key to Blackboard if you're curious to see the answers, but almost all of you did really well. Okay, so where did we leave off last time? So we worked through this problem of trying to demonstrate the gains from trade in this simple little two-country, two-good model. The United States and Japan, where the two countries try to trade quantities of wheat and computer with each other. And we came up with a trade between these two countries, which enabled both of them to benefit, right? So Japan and the United States could both consume some combination more of computers and wheat than they otherwise could had they just simply been economically self-sufficient, that is, consume what they produce on their own. I believe this is where I left off. So I constructed this table at the end of the class to identify which country had the lowest opportunity cost for the production of the two goods, because this is how we identify which trading partner here has the comparative advantage, right? And I think this is where we left off last time. We figured out that the opportunity cost of producing one computer for the US was 10 tons of wheat compared to 5 tons of wheat for Japan. By contrast, the opportunity cost of making 1 ton of wheat in the United States was only 1/10 of a computer compared to Japan's 1/5 of a computer. So here in this little example, the United States enjoys a comparative advantage in the production of wheat because the US can produce wheat at a lower opportunity cost than Japan, 1/10 obviously being less than 1/5. Whereas Japan has the comparative advantage in computer production. It only costs them 5 tons of wheat given up compared to the United States 10 tons of wheat. And so this brings us then to I guess the second and biggest conclusion from this section of the slides is that absolute advantage is not necessary for comparative advantage. In this example, the United States actually had the absolute advantage in the production of both goods. It's still the case, however, that the United States can benefit by specializing and trading with Japan. We just have to identify the gains from trade based on who has the comparative advantage. That is, who can produce which good at the lower opportunity cost. So it's opportunity cost and comparative advantage that really drives the potential gains from trade. Now let me stop here for just a moment and ask you guys to think about a little bit more this exercise that we've just done, or that we've carried over from the last class. You'll recall that the specific trade that we made in this example was the following. I believe the United States exchanged 700 tons of wheat for, what was it, 110 computers? Was that right? Yes. So what is the rate at which wheat is swapped for computers in this exchange? Well, 700 tons of wheat divided by 110 computers comes out to, I think if I punch this in on the calculator right, 6.36 tons of wheat per computer. So the rate at which the US swapped computers with Japan was that it gave up 6.36 tons of wheat for every one computer it got back in return. Effectively, that was the price of this particular exchange, okay? Now, I'm going to argue that there's really an infinite or a whole continuum of different possible trades that the US and Japan could have made here that would have been mutually beneficial. Could have been at a rate that's higher than 6.36 or lower, right? The total benefits from trade would have been distributed a little bit differently between the US and Japan, but there's still almost an infinite number of possible trades that one could show in which the US and Japan benefits. Here's the question I want you guys to think about, as well as you folks who are participating remotely. Is there a particular range of prices, that is tons of wheat per computer swapped, that trade between Japan and the United States would be mutually beneficial? In other words, or another way of asking this, are all possible trades between these two countries necessarily going to benefit both parties? First row, yeah. What's your name again? Matt, go ahead.
Anything between, or anything lower than 10 tons per computer would be beneficial. Anything above 5 tons per computer would be beneficial.
Beautiful, beautiful. Here is the range that is actually mutually beneficial, right? Think about this for a second. The United States is producing wheat and swapping that for computers. If Japan had offered a price to the United States that exceeds 10 tons of wheat per computer, then Matt, what happens? Well, that's a price that's more expensive than the US's own production costs for computers. The US would actually be better off just devoting some of its hours to making computers in that case. If the United States was gullible enough to agree to those terms, the US's total consumption would be lower than it otherwise would. Japan would do great, but the US would not do very well. What about a price, Matt, that's below 5 tons of wheat per computer? Exactly. The US gets the great deal, but Japan is the sucker, right? Think about it. Japan would never agree to sell computers to the US at a price or an opportunity cost that's less than 5 tons of wheat per computer. Why? Because that's a price that is below their own costs. You can't make a profit if you sell something at less than cost, right? So there is a range of prices here at which trade is mutually beneficial. And that range is between 5 tons of wheat per computer and 10 tons of wheat per computer. You can pick any number in that range, and there's an infinite number of possibilities that would make the US and Japan better off than what they would have been on their own. That is a point above their own individual production possibilities from here. Alternatively, you can think of the range in terms of tons of wheat per computer, or I'm sorry, computers per ton of wheat, right? That range is somewhere between 1/10 of a computer and 1/5 of a computer. It's the same information, it's just the reciprocal. The numbers are a little bit easier to understand, though, when you think of it in terms of opportunity cost of one computer in terms of wheat. So bear that in mind, is that, yes, trade can make both parties better off, but not necessarily every trade. The price of exchange, the rate at which one good is swapped for another, has to live within some interval, some viable bounds that make both trading partners better off than they otherwise would have been. Let me move back over to the slides, and I've just got a couple more to get through here. Anybody have any questions about that? Well, that makes sense. Okay, so let's just for a few minutes here, revisit the original question that was posed by me at the beginning of this section, and also by the economist Milton Friedman in that little video clip we watched at the very beginning of class last time. Think about this for a moment. Why is it that people, that communities, that cities, that countries choose, why do they choose to cooperate economically in a free exchange system? Why is it that people and even nations choose to rely on other people to help them meet their consumption demands rather than simply try to be economically self-sufficient, only consume what they themselves can produce? Why do we choose to actually be interdependent? You guys need to remind me here to switch the view. Why do people choose to be economically interdependent? Well, the reason is because of the very existence of opportunity costs, right? In the real world, opportunity costs are different from one producer to the next. You are hardly ever going to find a situation where different producers' opportunity costs are exactly the same. And because of that, there's always going to be opportunities then for specialization and therefore gains from trade. So it's the very existence of opportunity costs and comparative advantage that give rise to these gains from trade. That's why we choose to be economically connected, right? That's why, presumably, even though you may not have thought about it, why all of you guys and gals are here at college, right? Your goal is to graduate from college, specialize in some particular area, and go on and produce goods and services in that area and trade with other people in the economy. Just by being here, you're demonstrating that you don't want to be totally self-sufficient. You want to specialize, and that's going to enable you to obtain a much higher standard of living in the long run because of these gains from trade. Hopefully, you'll be trained in something that you're going to develop a comparative advantage in. So when each country specializes in the goods in which they have a comparative advantage, production in all countries can be higher, and everyone can gain from trade. Now, there's an important corollary that I want to add on to this, okay? This economic model, this little exercise we've done in class, demonstrates that there are gains to be had from trade and the free exchange system. But an important extra bit of information is that if you think about it, programs or institutions or laws that might stand in the way or inhibit the free exchange system are generally going to be, let's say, welfare reducing, right? If free trade and identifying who has comparative advantages allows us to boost consumption in the long run, then that means anything that inhibits the free trade system is probably going to lower our welfare and our consumption in the long run as well. Okay, that's just something I want you guys to think about when you're thinking about the efficiency of different kinds of laws, different kinds of policies that address exchange between individuals, exchange between countries, etc. Now, let me mention one last thing about this. I am definitely not naive enough to think that unlimited free trade policies, and particularly from one country to the next, necessarily benefit every member of our economy equally. In fact, one could argue that some members of society might actually be harmed by free trade agreements. Why is that? So I think the benefits of trade are pretty clear. We've demonstrated in this example. People should be able to consume or have access to a larger variety of goods, and the cost of getting those goods would be lower. That allows us to increase our consumption. That's what the basic or classical economic model suggests. But can you guys think of any reasons why unlimited kind of free trade policies where we don't impose any tariffs or any quotas, or we don't try to favor domestic industries compared to foreign industries, why that might or how that might hurt certain segments of the economy. Yeah, what's your name, second row? Wyatt. Okay, go ahead. Right. And so what I'm hearing from you then is that the people who might be hurt by those types of policies, at least in the short run, would be people who work for those local industries, whose income is hinges on the availability of those types of jobs. I definitely agree with that. And I'm not here to tell you that you should be in favor of completely free trade or against it. Again, that's not my job. I want you to think about these issues and balance the pros and the cons. But one of the things that I think you need to be aware of is that when it comes to these types of policies, there is probably a tension between the benefits of free trade in the long run, in terms of all consumers having access to more goods more cheaply, but there might be some short-run tension there because some workers, for instance, might lose their job, might be displaced if those particular industries get outsourced or offshored to another country where labor is cheaper, where that country might actually have a comparative advantage. So I'm definitely not arguing that free trade benefits everyone all the time. This article in The Guardian, if you're interested in that debate, tries to weigh the costs and benefits. If this stuff interests you, I know I've given much more emphasis in these slides on the benefits of free trade, but if you want to get into this debate at a deeper level to analyze some of the costs of them, for those of you who want to major in economics, I would encourage you later on to take one of our elective courses that spends an entire semester talking about international trade. And so all of those issues are discussed in much more detail there. But even in a principles class, I want you to be aware that there's two sides to the argument. Okay, any questions then about that? Why don't you guys take a few minutes to try and work on this one? So for those of you participating remotely, as well as everybody in class, I'd like you, if you can, to get out a piece of paper, or if you want to work this on your tablet, that's fine. Try to work through this problem that applies your understanding of absolute and comparative advantage. So I'll just read it for everyone here. Argentina and Brazil, let's say, each have 10,000 hours of labor per month. In Argentina, producing 1 pound of coffee requires 2 hours. Producing a bottle of wine requires 4 hours of work. In Brazil, producing a pound of coffee requires 1 hour. Producing a bottle of wine requires 5 hours. A couple of straightforward questions. And these would be kind of like questions that might appear on an exam of this level of difficulty. Which country has an absolute advantage in the production of coffee? And which country has a comparative advantage in the production of wine? The answer to that second question will tell us who should specialize in which item. Why don't you folks take a few minutes to work through that one, and then we'll go over the answer together. Hopefully the answers aren't already on your slides like they are on mine. I think I left you space to fill in answers on the next slide, but I'm not sure. Okay, who can help me out with an answer to this one? So the first question was, who has an absolute advantage in the production of coffee? Is it Brazil or Argentina, and why? Matt? Okay, go ahead.
Brazil has an absolute advantage in producing coffee.
Perfect, right? Very straightforward. Remember what absolute advantage is. It's the comparison among producers according to how many resources are used, right? It only takes an hour for Brazilian labor to make a pound of coffee compared to 2 hours in Argentina. So Brazil has the absolute advantage in coffee production. Matt, who has the absolute advantage then in wine production? Argentina does. It only takes a worker in Argentina 4 hours to make a bottle of wine compared to Brazil's 5 hours. Okay? All right. Now, the second part of the question is who has the comparative advantage for each good? So maybe some of you can kind of see this instantly. Others are maybe struggling with the concept a little bit more. So to figure out who has comparative advantage, what we want to do is first calculate the opportunity costs. All right, so that's what I'm going to do here in this table on the right. Who can tell me what the opportunity cost of 1 pound of coffee in Argentina is? Yeah, fourth row. Half of a bottle of wine, right? It takes 2 hours to make coffee in Argentina. If those 2 hours are shifted to wine production, they're only going to produce a half a bottle of wine because it takes 4 hours to make a bottle of wine, right? So what then would be the opportunity cost of a bottle of wine in Argentina? Just the reciprocal, right? It would be 2 pounds of coffee. Let me come back to you. What would be the, what's your name? Sean, what's the opportunity cost of a pound of coffee in Brazil? 1/5 of a bottle of wine. And therefore, the opportunity cost of a bottle of wine would be 5 pounds of coffee. All right, so we've got plenty of information there to answer the second problem. Which of these two countries enjoys the comparative advantage in, let's say, wine production? Argentina or Brazil? In wine production, it's going to be Argentina, right? It only takes, Argentina only has to give up, so to speak, 2 pounds of coffee to produce a bottle of wine, compared to Brazil having to give up 5 pounds of coffee. Brazil, so be careful about these now. The math is easy, but sometimes you can get confused because you're talking about costs of one good in terms of another. The opportunity cost of coffee in Brazil is only 1/5 of a bottle of wine compared to a half of a bottle of wine in Argentina. So Brazil has the comparative advantage in coffee production. Argentina has the comparative advantage in wine production. The law of comparative advantage then says that if Argentina and Brazil want to trade with one another, Argentina should specialize in wine production, Brazil should specialize in coffee production, and they should trade with one another. What would be an example of a mutually beneficial trade? What price would work, for example, between these two countries? Let's say in terms of bottles of wine, in terms of pounds of coffee. Any price between 2 and 5, right? A price higher than 1 bottle of wine for 2 pounds of coffee is enough to cover Argentina's cost, but is not so high that Brazil can't profit by purchasing wine from Argentina, right? Remember, any trade has to fall within the 2 opportunity costs. Okay, you guys have any questions then about that one? Pretty straightforward. I still have plenty of time in class today, so actually what I want to do is go back and do a review question on some material that we covered in the first section of the course, but I didn't quite have enough time to ask you this in class. So here's a different problem I would like you to work out. And again, I'm forgetting to switch. Multiple things I'm trying to move back and forth from here. Okay, so this is an active learning exercise that was in the first section of slides on the 10 big ideas in economics. Let's say that you're selling your 1996 Mustang. You've already spent $1,000 on repairs. Now at the last minute, unfortunately, let's say the transmission dies, okay? You go to a mechanic tells you that you can repair it, but it's gonna cost you $600. Alternatively, you can sell the car as is, right, without fixing the transmission. Here's what I want you guys to think about. In each of the following scenarios, should you have the transmission repaired? That's the decision you have to make. You're going to sell the car. You're either going to sell it with a fixed transmission or a broken transmission. So that's the decision, is whether or not to repair it. That is to pay the $600. Let's look at 2 different scenarios and see how your decision might change from one to the other. Let's suppose that the Blue Book value, which is what you could get for the car, is $6,500 if the transmission works, but only $5,700 if it doesn't work. In the second example, let's assume the Blue Book value is $6,000 if the transmission works, but $5,500 if it doesn't. In each of those cases, I want you to tell me whether or not it makes economic sense to actually pay to do the repairs, and explain why. The math here is very, very simple, but it's the economic reasoning that I want you to think about or apply from one of the principles or concepts that appeared earlier in these slides. What would a rational economic agent do in situation A? First off, let's review something. What's the fundamental kind of characteristic of rational decision making? Say again? People making decisions by thinking on the margin. Perfect. That means you want to weigh the marginal costs against the marginal benefits of small incremental changes in your behavior, right? So, I've already forgot, Sean, is that right? We know what the marginal cost of fixing the transmission is. It's $600, right? In scenario A, what is the marginal benefit of fixing the transmission? Not the total benefit or the average benefit, but the marginal benefit. How do you get that? $6,500 minus what now? Yeah. I see. Okay. Right. So the marginal cost is 600, The marginal benefit is 800, right? Is 6,500 minus 5,700. So there is a net $200 marginal benefit, right? 800 minus 600 is positive 200. That's the correct way to think about it, right? Notice, Sean, what doesn't matter here. The $1,000 that you've already spent fixing up the car earlier, right? That's more or less kind of a sunk cost. What matters for your decision making in the moment is just whether the marginal benefit exceeds the marginal cost. How about part B? How do things change there? If the Blue Book value is now 6,000, if the transmission works, but only 5,500 if it doesn't work, then Sean, what happens to that marginal benefit? Well, it goes from 800 to 500, in which case the marginal cost, 600, exceeds the marginal benefit by 100. So you get on net a negative $100 loss. And so in that case, because the marginal cost exceeds the marginal benefit, it does not make economic sense to repair the transmission. Very simple, straightforward problem that applies the concept of rational thinking on the margin, okay? That's how economic decision makers behave, is by weighing marginal costs and benefits in order to optimize their consumption or their income or whatever. All right, you guys have any questions about that one? No? Moving right along then. Let's look at some other review questions. So here are the a set of review questions that I believe I've posted to Blackboard. I would encourage you guys, I'm not ever going to be able to do all of them in class, but from time to time as you're reading the material and studying for the exams, I think these would be worth your time to go and work. And I believe the answer keys are also posted into Blackboard. Let's take a look at number 2. I want you to tell me if the following statements are true or false. And in each case, really what's more important is that you explain why it's true or false. A, 2 countries can achieve gains from trade if one of the countries has an absolute advantage in the production of all goods. Is that true or false? 2 countries can achieve gains from trade even if one of the countries has an absolute advantage in everything. Sean? It's true, right? In fact, what the example that we did in class last time met this criteria exactly, right? The US had an absolute advantage in the production of both goods. And so absolute advantage is not critical for demonstrating gains from trade. One of the trading partners can have an absolute advantage in everything. How about B? Certain very talented people have a comparative advantage in everything they do. True or false? Help me out again. Wyatt, okay. Why? I agree with you. Why is that false? Why not? I think you were on the right track. Go ahead, keep going with that. That's right. So if you have a low opportunity cost of one good, you are going to, by comparison, have a relatively higher opportunity cost of the other good, right? Just because Steph Curry can mow the grass a lot better, a lot more efficiently, a lot quicker than the guy that works for the landscaping crew, doesn't mean that he should cut his own grass, right? Because every hour he's cutting his grass is an hour he's not devoting to honing his three-point skills or cutting a commercial that could be really lucrative, right? So even very talented people aren't going to have a comparative advantage in everything that they do. C, if a certain trade is good for one person, it can't be good for the other one. If a certain trade is good for one person, it can't be good for the other. I see somebody back in the back. No? Anybody over here? If a certain trade is good for one person, it can't possibly be good for the other. True or false? Fourth row, this side of the room. Grams. Sorry? Yeah, so if a trade benefits one person, it can very well benefit another trading partner as well, right? The whole purpose of trade is to specialize so that both trading partners can mutually benefit from the exchange. How about D, slightly different question. If a certain trade is good for one person, it is always good for the other. Why? Yeah, so we looked at a couple of examples where there might be a trade that benefits the US, for example, but the terms of trade, the price at which computers and wheat are swapped, is actually worse than it would be for Japan to simply produce wheat on its own, right? Remember, the price of exchange has to be between the two countries' individual opportunity costs in order for the trade to be mutually beneficial. So just because you've identified a trade that's good for me doesn't mean that we've identified a trade that is also good for you. Last one, if trade is good for a country overall, let's say, it must be good for everyone in the country. Would you agree or disagree with that statement? Sean? Why? Yeah, I think there's good reason to believe that having completely open and free exchange with every other country in the world, at least in the short run, could potentially harm individuals who are working in industries where the United States doesn't really enjoy a comparative advantage. Because what classical free exchange economics would predict is that those industries or sectors would eventually be offshored to another country, a country that has that comparative advantage. People in those industries domestically would be temporarily displaced from a job and experience some amount of economic pain, okay? So there's this, again, there's this tension between the long run benefits of trade and the short run costs for those people who are kind of the losers from these trade agreements. Very good. Okay. Any last questions then about that one? You guys think you have a grasp of this, or do you want to work one more problem? I have one more. It's a little bit more detailed, but I don't know. With the masks and everything, it's hard to read everybody's body language. I'm certainly happy to go over one more with you guys or give you an opportunity to do another one. But if you think that you understand the material well enough, then we can end here. Okay, everybody close their eyes for a second. Close your eyes. I don't want to see any pupils, okay? Raise your hand if you want to do one more problem. Raise your hand if you want to leave class now and go do something more interesting. Well, all of you had to vote. Some of you were not very enthusiastic about that. Okay, we'll stop there. I think most of you guys get this material. For those of you who, there were a few that wanted to see one more problem, I can show you which one I had planned to do if you want to see that. But we'll just go ahead and end class there, and we will start on, let's see, next Tuesday with our discussion of a review of supply, demand, and market equilibrium. Okay, that's where we're kind of headed next week. Once we get through that material, by the way, we'll be ready to move on into topics that are more squarely kind of in the realm of macroeconomics. These first few sections of this course are kind of a review of some micro topics that are still going to be important as we apply them to different macroeconomic applications. Okay, everybody have a good weekend. Stay safe.